Paul sent into other people's life came back into his. Even though he was converted, even though he asked God for forgiveness, he had set in motion universal principles that was operative and they cannot be overturned. That is, we're going to look at it today, that Saul had people killed for the faith, and Paul ends up being killed for the faith. He had people stoned to death for the faith. He ends up being stoned. He had people put in jail for the faith. He was put in jail for the faith. He harassed and persecuted people because of their commitment to Christ. Somebody harassed and persecuted him for his commitment to Christ. So that the same things he sent into other people's life came back into his, even though he was converted. But now, here is the good news, that even though all of that stuff came back into his life that he had sent into the lives of others, God took those persecutions as tools to shape Paul into the image that Paul had become. So that you don't get to escape what you sent into the life of other people. It's coming back into your own life because you are in violation of a universal principle. But when those things start to come back into your own life, then God can redeem it and use it to benefit you, even though you're going to go through it. And so that's why you have to be careful about how you treat people. You have to be careful what you do to people, because what you are doing, you are literally doing it to yourself. And that's a good way to look at it, that the way you treat people is ultimately the way you are treating yourself, because it's coming back. And I tell young preachers who came up under me and have gone out into the pastorate, I say to them all the time, when they were here, don't wait until you get to your church to start pastoring your church. Start pastoring it right now by the way you treat and respect this pastor is the way your church is going to treat and respect or disrespect you. So you can't come and be disrespectful, disobedient, and just surly towards this church and this pastor, and then you get to your church thinking that your church is going to treat you any differently than how you treated your church and your pastor. It's coming back. So don't wait until you get to your church before you start setting the tone and the environment of your church. And you set that by how you respect and treat the church you're serving now. So it comes back into your life, and it came back into the life of Paul. But we're looking at Paul before he was converted. And Paul comes on the scene at the expense of one of the church's greatest leaders, Deacon Stephen. We find that in the book of Acts chapter 6, that Stephen was selected by the disciples to serve in the capacity of deacon, the diaconate ministry, diaconate. And diaconate literally means servant, because that's what the diaconate is. That's what deacons are. They are servants of God as they serve the people of God. And so this is Stephen. He comes on the scene in Acts chapter 6. And the Bible describes him as a man that's full of God's grace and power and performed great wonders and signs among the people. And opposition arose, however, from the members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews from Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the province of Cilicia in Asia, who began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom. That's Acts chapter 6, verse 8 and following. So here is Stephen. He is standing up and he is proclaiming Jesus. And this great servant of God understood the history of his people, understood the history of the Old Testament, his forebears. And he begins to share the history of his forebears to the Sanhedrin Council. And he shares it in a way that he wove into his historical narrative Jesus Christ, who the Sanhedrin Council had years earlier voted to crucify. You know, they voted to execute Jesus. Now here is Stephen, and these are Jews we're talking about. Here is Stephen, who stands up before the Sanhedrin Council, and he rehearses the history of the Jews, and he weaves into that history Christ as the promised Messiah of God, who the Sanhedrin Council, he says, shook his finger in their faces, said, y'all killed him. The one that God has sent here to be the Messiah, you were so dull and spiritually insensitive that you didn't even recognize who he was, and you voted to put him to death, but God raised him up. And he has risen from the dead. And so Stephen is going through this, and he's preaching this thing to the Sanhedrin Council, and they get so upset. You know, when you read his speech in chapter 7 of the book of Acts, after he finishes speaking, the verse says, when the Sanhedrin Council heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen was full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven, and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, they covered their ears and yelled at the top of their voices. They all rushed at him, dragging him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he said this, he fell asleep. Chapter 8, verse 1. And Saul approved of their killing him. Now this is Saul, who will later be known as Paul, making his biblical curtain call on the stage of biblical history at the expense of Stephen. You know what that reminds me of? There is a certain political candidate who made his entry onto the political scene by dogging out a certain black president, calling him an imposter and saying that he was not born here in the United States, that he was not a real natural American, which was so racist in its orientation. That's how this person entered into the political arena, on the basis of his racism towards the nation's first black president. And so this is how Saul makes his appearance on the stage of biblical history, at the expense of Stephen. The difference between Saul and this certain presidential candidate is that at some point Saul got converted. And we're still waiting on that other person. Saul got converted, and And so here Saul is. And so he disappears from the conversation, and he reappears in chapter 9 of the book of Acts. And it says in verse 1, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And from that point forward, Saul's life had been changed. Prior to that, Saul was driven by religion without a relationship with Christ. And religious people without relationship with God are the most dangerous people you will ever meet. Because they do things based upon their religious orientation. And they literally believe they are right in doing what they do. You know, when you have a religion that drives you to murder people, to stone people, to imprison people, that religion is absent of God, at least the God that's revealed in Jesus Christ. That ain't how the God we know in Jesus, that's not how he rolls. That's not how that God operates. Anytime you are moved by a religion to hurt people, to harm people, to dehumanize people, to imprison people, to oppress people, and you're using your religion to justify it, something is evil and wrong about that religion's perspective, that religious persuasion. Something is wrong with it. And we see Jesus dealing with this type of religion that puts people in bondage rather than setting people free. You will know the religion is from God. How? Because God is always setting people free. Anytime you have a religion that puts people in bondage, we know that that's not of God. But any religious tradition that sets people free, we know that that is of God, because that's what God is about. God is about setting the oppressed free. So you ask, why is this, when we're dealing with Paul, you ask, why is this religion so important? You know, why is it? I mean, here is Saul going around killing people based on religion. You know, you would think that, okay, it's just, some of us might say, it's just religion. It's just something that's segmented on the side. It's not, it doesn't comprise your whole life. I mean, as I used to read this, that's what would be going through my mind. I mean, this is it's just religion. But I was under the influence of a Western understanding of religion. John S. M. Beatty, that great Cambridge scholar, he once said that Judaism and Christianity really should be considered African traditional religions because of where they originated. They originated in Palestine. Palestine is connected to the continent of Africa. It's connected to Egypt. Egypt is on the continent of Africa. And if it's on the continent of Africa, that makes it a religious if it's on the continent of Africa, that would make it a African religion, if that's where it emerged. So John Nishambiti argues that, and one of the salient features of all African religions is that they are never segmented, they are never divorced from different parts of your life. African religions encompass the entire life. It is not something that you just do on Sunday and be done with it Monday through Saturday night. But religion, African religion, it takes up the entire life. It's a part of who you are. It's not something that you pick up and put down. It's not something that you do sometimes and you don't do other times. But the African traditional religion, Spirit of God is with you, and it influences every area of your life, from birth to death and everything in between. Afterlife, everything. African traditional religion. Now, you get to the West, it's not quite like that. Religion is over here, business is here, family is here, my job is here, my friends are here. So religion is only a small segment of my life. That's why when I read into this, I can look at it in confusion and say, well, it doesn't mean that much, because it's just religion. It's just a small part of a person's life. But that's not how they understood their religion. Their religion embraced every part of life. That's why it was so important for Saul to go after these people, because this was life itself. And so that's why Saul was going after them, and that's why it meant so much to these Jews of the first century, because they are literally practicing an African religion, and all African religions encompasses the entire being, the entire social structure. It influences every area of your life. So here is Saul going after these people and trying to murder them on the basis of religion. Now, the religion that Paul was pursuing was a adulterated version of the religion of Moses. It was a version of religion that had gone bad because it had been manipulated by the religious leaders of Israel of that day. The religion of Moses is good. The religion of Moses is awesome. But by the time we get to the New Testament, it had become so adulterated. Here's how it became adulterated. They were, in the New Testament world, and I'm going to point out some passages in it, they were under the influence of Rome. All right, now they're living in the Roman Empire. You got the emperor of Rome. He's controlling everything. He was also controlling how they understood and practiced the religion of Moses. Rome could have, and they were so powerful, they could have attacked Jerusalem and stopped them from worshiping. They could have shut down the temple. They could have suspended the religion of Moses, which is what Antiochus Epiphanes did 200 years earlier during the days of the Maccabees, during the intertestamental period. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did. He shut down the worship of Yahweh. In fact, he came to Jerusalem and shut down the temple and reopened it and made it a shrine to their gods. And he was sacrificing pigs in the temple on the altar of Yahweh, because he had taken over their temple and taken over their religion and shut down the worship of Jehovah, the religion of Moses. Rome could have done that, but they didn't. They didn't want all of that drama. So what they did, they said, we're not going to shut it down, but we're going to control the religious leaders. And here's how, one of the ways that we're going to control you is that you can teach the Torah, But you don't need to be dealing with the prophets. We want you to deal with thou shalt and thou shalt not. We want you to deal with the Sabbath day, keep the Sabbath. We want you to deal with personal piety. We don't need you to start teaching the prophets, because when you start teaching the prophets, the prophet Isaiah is going to start prophesying and preaching against the oppression and domination of the Roman Empire, which is what they did in the Old Testament. They were prophesying against Babylon, who had dominated them. They were prophesying against their own kings, who were dominating those at the bottom. So Rome said, you can teach thou shalt and thou shalt not, personal piety stuff, but you need to leave the prophets out of this. Because if you bring the prophets in it, you're going to raise up a people with a prophetic voice who's going to speak out against how Rome is dominating the people of Israel. So you don't need that. Just keep that out. And they did, thereby bastardizing the total religion of Moses. Because you can't have the law without the prophets. You can't have the Torah without the prophets. You need them both. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how that's playing out in American culture, especially with white evangelicalism. Because the moment someone stands up and start preaching prophetically against the American regime that's oppressing people at the bottom, the first thing people say, well, we need to keep politics out of this. The same thing Rome said to the Old Testament, to the New Testament Hebrews. Keep politics out of it. Just go with personal piety. Just go with being nice to people. And Jesus died on the cross, and you're going to heaven, which is essential to the gospel message. But it's not all the gospel message. Oh yeah, every Sunday we invite people to give their lives to Christ, because that's crucial, that's essential. But there is also a social expression of our faith. It's not just personal. And when we talk about a personal faith, we're not only talking about just going to heaven, but we're also talking about me, my little house, my 2.5 children, my car, my two-car garage house. That's what we're talking. My little education, my little this is always personal. And that's what white evangelicalism stresses, personal. When you step outside the personal and start looking at the society that our person emerged from and don't address it, if you address it according to white evangelicals, then you are stepping outside, and that ain't the gospel. To the point where John MacArthur even said that Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Christian. And this white evangelical in California. And he got a church full of black folk. And he's standing up there talking about Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Christian. And you ask him why? Because he preached liberation to people who are oppressed, and that's not the gospel. The same thing was happening in New Testament Israel. You don't preach against domination. You don't preach against the regime. You don't prophesy against the emperor, because you're going beyond the bounds of what we have established. So y'all just do thou shalt and thou shalt not stuff. Just keep it neat, keep it nice. Just do y'all Sabbath thing, y'all do your kosher food thing, and thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, y'all stay with that. Don't bring Isaiah in it, because it's going to be a problem. Because Isaiah's going to say something. Don't bring Amos in this. Because when you start reading Amos, it's going to be a problem. Lead them out. Let's just be nice to each other and lead them out. That's the extent of their religion. And even in that, they were holding people in bondage. Turn to the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 3, and verse 1. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "What is lawful on the Sabbath? To do what is good or to do what is evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians on how they might kill Jesus. Stretch out your hands. And all of this had to do with religion, the Sabbath day. Because again, it had become so adulterated, their religion of Moses, that it was now depriving people of life. Jesus goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath. Now, this man's hand was shriveled yesterday. It would have been shriveled tomorrow. Why would Jesus wait until the Sabbath day to perform this miracle on this man? Why? He could have waited until the Sabbath was over. He could have done it before the Sabbath start. Why would he wait until the Sabbath to do this? This was a form of protest. This story is not so much about the man with the withered hand. This is about a protest. Jesus was always, and that's what a protest is. It's doing stuff that you ain't supposed to do when you're supposed to be doing it. Just to disrupt the status quo. Just to agitate the status quo. When we see people marching in the streets protesting, you know, it's a form of resistance. It's a form of criticism. It's a form of a counter way of dealing with the status quo. It's countering the status quo. So this is a form of protest right here. Jesus is protesting the Sabbath. He's protesting how they are doing the Sabbath, because the Sabbath had become a mechanism of oppression and domination rather than a mechanism of freedom. When you go back to the Old Testament and look at the Sabbath when it's first mentioned in the book of Genesis, after God creates the heavens and the earth, and he gets to the last day, and he rested on the Sabbath. The Sabbath day initially in its purest form meant a day of rest. In its purest form, a day of rest. You know, and I don't want to get into why a day of rest was required for the ancient Israelites. I think we've already dealt with that on several occasions. Suffice it to say, it was designed as a day to rest. But when the religious leaders got it, they started trying to explain, what does rest mean? How do we define rest? What constitutes rest? And they had so many different rules for the Sabbath. I mean, it was like, if somebody was sick, you can keep them alive, but you can't cure them until after the Sabbath. You know, if you have a bag of flour, if it weighs over a certain amount, you can't carry it until after the Sabbath. If it weighed under a certain amount, you can pick it up and carry it, but you can only go 15 steps. And stuff like that. You know, if somebody is sick on the Sabbath, you have to just let them be sick until the Sabbath day is over. And Jesus is looking at this and saying, you have turned something, you have made the Sabbath a burden rather than the blessing that God intended for it to be. You are overthinking it. You are overdoing it. And the reason you are overdoing it is because it's your desire to control people's lives and to keep people in bondage. And so here is Jesus protesting this. He says to them, which is it right to do on the Sabbath? What does he say? He says, and some of them were looking for a reason. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, verse 4, then Jesus asked him, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Which is lawful? That means, what is it in the law of God to do good on the Sabbath? He said, is it lawful? In other words, does God want us to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? How does God want us to understand the Sabbath? Is it a period for us to do good or to do evil? To give life or to take life? Here is the essence of power. Now, Jesus has the power to heal this man. Jesus said, is it lawful to give life or to take life? Is it lawful to do good or to do evil? What do you mean, Jesus? I have the power to heal this man. If I don't heal this man, then by default, I'm hurting this man. I've got the power to do good to this man. If I don't do good to this man, then by default, I'm doing evil to this man. Power is binary. Power has no neutrality. In other words, if you got power and you're not using it to do good, then by default, you're doing evil. If you have the power to heal and you withhold that power, then by default, you are killing. So there is no neutrality. There is no middle ground. There's no way you can say, well, I ain't got nothing to do with it. Yeah, if you got the power and you're not using it to do good, then by default, you are doing evil. You mean you got the power to feed somebody and you don't use that power to feed them, then by default, you're taking food off of his table. Power is binary. You're either using it for good, and if you don't use it for good, then by default, you're using it for evil. That's what Jesus is dealing with here in the Sabbath, on the Sabbath day in the synagogue. Jesus is saying, I've got this power. It's on the Sabbath. The power of God is at work in me. Does God want me to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? And they just looked at it because they couldn't deal with Jesus. Too revolutionary for them. Just too much. He was too radical for them. But he's radical within the framework of the Scripture. Because the Scripture is radical. Until it has become domesticated by people who can't handle the radicality of the Scripture. And that is what's happened in our society. That has what been happening in our world, in our culture. And so we see Paul, who was under this influence. Jesus said another thing. I believe it's in Luke chapter, give me a minute here. Okay. Where is it where Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead? I believe that will be in Luke 9. Yeah, that's where it is. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. Jesus was calling people to follow him in discipleship. And Luke chapter 9 verse 59, Jesus, he said to another man, follow me. But he replied, Lord, let me first go bury my father. Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. You know, when you first read that, that sounds really cold on Jesus's part. But it's not really cold if you understand what the brother is saying. He told this man, follow me. In this whole question of discipleship, follow me. And the man said, let me go bury my father first, and then I'll, follow you after that. This is not about the man burying the father. Because in the Jewish culture, the law said when your loved one dies, you bury him the next day. To this day, that's how the Jews do it. You die tonight, you get buried tomorrow. So apparently, the man had just died that particular day. The law said you need to bury him by tomorrow. Jesus is critiquing, again, how they are practicing the religion of Moses. Jesus said, follow me. This is urgency to follow me. This man said, yeah, but I need to observe the rules of the laws of Moses as they have been adulterated by this culture. So my first commitment is not to following you, but my first commitment is obeying an adulterated brand of the religion of Moses. And so Jesus is calling that religious observation dead. So what he is saying is, let that dead religion deal with dead people. You follow me. So on every point, Jesus is critiquing the religion of Moses as it was practiced during his time. The Apostle Paul is under the influence of that adulterated brand of the religion of Moses. And we know he is because he's killing people in the name of that religion. We know he is because he's stoning people and putting people in jail in the name of that religion. So we're talking about the villains of the Bible, and what we're trying to do is to see ourselves as those villains. Because all of us got some Saul in us. We all do. We got some Saul in us. Because we have allowed our understanding of God to put other people in bondage, to hurt other people, to dog other people, to condemn other people. We had a young couple who was a member of our church years ago. In fact, an entire family years ago. And they were so fundamental in their approach that they were in bondage, and you can tell they were strapped into their religion. They didn't want to do anything. When I would be up preaching about this, they would look at me like I'm a heretic, And we were dealing with the question of marriage and that type of thing. And there was a couple that I was going to marry, and both of them had been divorced. And I was in the pulpit were we over here? We were on Midhofer. And I announced that they were getting married. And this particular family knew both of them. And knew both of them had been divorced. And they approached me, you know, mother and father and the children approached me and said, we disagree with your position. I said, what position is that? That you're getting ready to perform a wedding ceremony for these two people when both of them are divorced. And Jesus said in the Bible, if a man divorces his wife and remarries, she commits adultery. So you are putting two adulterers together. And I said, but you didn't read where the woman caught in adultery and came to Jesus? And people sort of like you had stones and was ready to stone her to death. And Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground and stood up and said to those, he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. Did you ever read that? And Jesus said to the woman, go and sin no more. He forgave her. You know, so you got a God who can't forgive you for mistakes that you've made, and you are condemned to that same mistake for the rest of your life? Well, the word is what it is. I said, okay. Years later, one of the daughters got married, and her marriage didn't work out. She got a divorce. And I knew they weren't members of our church anymore. But I knew she had gotten a divorce. And I saw her out on one occasion, and I struck up a conversation. Well, how you doing? You know, blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm doing fine. So how's the marriage going? She said, well, Pastor, you know, it really didn't work out, and so I got a divorce. And she was in her mid-30s, a young lady. And I said, wow, for the rest of your life, you got to be by yourself. And she said, no, I don't. And I said, well, ain't that what you told me? She said, that was then. This is now. You know. So, you know, until you experience it, you know what I mean? Until you go through with it, sometimes we can take this religion and we can use it to put ourselves and other people into bondage. The very bondage that Jesus came to deliver us from. The very bondage that Jesus came to deliver us from, we find ourselves going back into that bondage. So we really need to relook at how we understand how God is at work in our lives and what God is doing in our lives before we start putting ourselves and other people in this bondage. And we see the Apostle Paul got set free from that. When he had an encounter with Jesus, the man was set free from all of that. You know, so we have some Saul in us in that we allow our religious restraints to rob us of joy and freedom. And when that happens, we need to recognize that God is not in that, and we need to be set free from it. You know. So anyway, do we have any questions? All right. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for streaming with us. And again, we are on hiatus until September, but you can catch us on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock here at the Mount Carmel Church, 9610 East 42nd Street, Indianapolis, Indiana. We are here at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. We look forward to your coming and sharing with us. May the Lord continue to bless your life real good. And please come and see us at the Mount Carmel Church this coming Sunday. God bless you, and may the Lord be with you. All right.